It's a war that broke all rules. It's a war that broke all conventions.
There's nobody who's not saying there's severe hunger verging on famine in Gaza. There's nobody not saying that. There's nobody not saying that Israel is targeting the civilian population. There's nobody not saying that an unprecedented number of journalists have been killed, medics have been killed, UN workers have been killed. There's complete consensus.
The day after October 7, the world and the people of Gaza woke up to a darker, more brutal reality. In our last episode, we looked at life in the Gaza Strip before the day that would soon bring annihilation there, destroy the West Bank, and transform the entire region as we know it. For Gazans, what they considered a normal life under siege transformed into a relentless and ongoing struggle for survival, defined by constant death, uncertainty, danger, and desperation, with no end in sight a year later.
On my last visit to the north, we were given a specific route to follow to achieve our humanitarian mission. And I could have a look from behind on the neighborhood where I lived. I could see where I used to live. And as we were still traveling, we were passing by areas that I could not identify anymore where were we. And this is something that you can hear from anyone who goes with us. Like if you are familiar with Gaza and you are driving on the Saladin Road, you can see the Mediterranean from Salah ad-Din Street. So the landscape of Gaza has significantly changed.
This is Hisham Hanna, spokesman for the International Committee of the Red Cross in Gaza. He has lived his entire life in the Strip and says he's never seen anything like this despite living through war after war. Even for the ICRC, which has been in Gaza since 1967, nothing of this scale has ever been recorded.
Wherever you go in Gaza, whether in the south, the middle, or if you are in the north, you would witness, instead of densely populated neighborhoods and concrete facade, you would see empty spaces with lots of rubble or lots of nylon and wood. And this is basically where people live or displaced at. All parks, playgrounds, archaeological sites, even the seashore, the seaside, the beach looks have changed. If you walk by the seaside road, you cannot see the beach because it's covered with tents and people actually live there.
With 9 out of 10 people in Gaza displaced, some up to 20 times, virtually every family there has had to pick up their belongings and live in inhumane conditions, in tents made up of bed sheets or flour sacks sewn together, or a temporary UN shelter that would not keep them cool in the heat or warm in the cold. Basic resources like water, food, and hygiene supplies are scarce. Even before Israel's war, drinking water was not available for everyone in Gaza. Today, with Israel shutting off its supply lines and aid reduced to just a fraction of the growing needs, Gazans have to walk miles just to fill up a few jugs. Their only access to food is in cans, which has caused people to get sick after eating it for so long. Thousands have forgotten what real chicken, vegetables, and fruit taste like. This is life for the living, while tens of thousands have been killed. Nearly 100,000 people have been injured, and thousands more are missing or under rubble. So-called humanitarian zones are not safe from Israeli bombardment, and they're ever shrinking, with 30,000 people confined to every square kilometer. Gazans now have no choice but to try and survive with what little they have, and with the fear that they could be next. This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. In today's episode, we'll take a deep look into the humanitarian catastrophe currently unfolding in Gaza, where more than 41,500 people have been killed so far, and 96,000 people have been injured in a year. We'll explore the challenges facing international aid organizations, the reactions within Israeli society, and the toll that Israel's war has taken on Palestinians in the West Bank. Our episode features voices and views from UNRWA, the ICRC, an Israeli Knesset member, and Israel's prison service, along with perspectives from American political scientist Norman Finkelstein and Palestinian activist Arab Barghouthi. Israel's military declined our request for an interview after initially accepting and the Foreign Ministry said it will not be able to participate in this series. The ongoing brutality in Gaza is unlike any other in recent years. From the ground, the world has been watching the carnage live-streamed, minute by minute. Everybody with internet access or a television screen can watch and stay informed on everything unfolding in Gaza. All this, despite Israel making it impossible for foreign journalists to enter, replacing traditional ways of reporting the news with social media, which has now become an essential platform for a wide range of perspectives, personal stories, and an arena for Gaza's endless tragedies. No matter where you are in the world, it's become difficult to remain unaware of what's happening in the Middle East. And behind the constant feed of videos and images are Gazan journalists, professionals, and citizens documenting what they can while navigating the same dangers they report on. They live in tents, survive on one meal a day, and file stories while fleeing bomb threats and searching for their own families under the rubble. Many of these journalists were killed by Israel's onslaught there. Some of them, like the National's Nagham Hanna, have survived. Every morning, our team here had to wake up to make that dreaded phone call to Nagham as Israeli tanks surrounded her home in the north of Gaza. That phone call to determine whether she is still alive. With spotty internet and communications often down, especially during Israeli military operations, getting in touch with Nagham became increasingly difficult, and the prospect that she had been harmed was constantly on our minds. Here's Nagham telling us what it was like for her as a journalist covering the war.
This war is not like before wars. You can't imagine where is the safe area and where is the danger area. So I was trying to keep my children around me. But if I want to go to the hospitals or to cover any incidents happen, I have to leave them. So I used to leave them with my nieces and my mother. But all the time I'm thinking about them. What if a bomb happened next to them? What if I got injured or something happened with me? So, you know that you can't be focused 100% with your work while you are thinking about the people who are behind you.
She described the very difficult decision of moving and leaving the place she grew up in search for a potentially better future and safety for her children, something she was not guaranteed to find.
I didn't want to go to the south. I wasn't sure how is the south will be. So I decided to stay with my family in Gaza. But one day my husband told me, you have to come to the south. I want to be sure that my kids is with me. That's happened with him after his college lost 4 of his children. So I forced to move from Gaza City to the south, walking. I walked while I'm holding my 2 years boy, Qais, and Omar was walking in front of me. It was the most humiliation moment I lived in my life. Just to take approval from Israeli soldier to tell you move, stop here, don't move. This road used to take from us like 10 minutes, but it takes from us like 2 hours to cross it.
Nagham eventually left Gaza, but 2 million people remain, enduring internal displacement and the ongoing horrors of the war. Still in Gaza, the ICRC's Hisham Hanna tells us what life is like for those people.
I visited the north about a month ago, and we were visiting Al Ahli Arab Hospital, one of the hospitals we visited for technical assessment. And I could see that at the back of the hospital, I could see 3 dead bodies surrounded by a dozen people, and there were like a few children just playing with a football and a girl who was skating, playing around dead bodies.
At the start of this war last year, social media feeds were full of gut-wrenching scenes from the streets and hospitals of Gaza. Mutilated children, families wailing and weeping, hunched over body bags, people screaming in panic as they searched for their loved ones in the aftermath of a recent strike. Children traumatized, shocked, and shivering after surviving. And while all of that is enough to sear itself in the world's collective memory of what was going on in Gaza, Surreal scenes paint a picture of what normal looks like now for the people living there, like children playing with a football or roller skating next to dead bodies outside a hospital. Bodies that belong to people who may have been injured and transferred to a hospital in the hopes that their lives would be saved. But for many who don't even get the most basic medical care, death becomes inevitable. Bodies in Gaza are coming in faster than they could be dealt with. Hospitals we spoke to in the early months of the war told us that they have been storing corpses in ice cream trucks or refrigerators as the morgues filled up. Thousands of people were buried in the backyards of houses or hospitals because it was too dangerous to reach cemeteries. Hisham recounts more of the harrowing experiences that Gazans are living through nowadays.
I remember I was contacted by a mother who was urging me to, urging the ICRC to help her retrieve the dead body of her daughter. She was 11 years old. Her name was Shayma. And she was under the rubble of their house for 2 days. And she was the only thing she was asking for, and she was very quiet. She was very, I wouldn't say resilient because there is no resilience in this situation, but she was calm over the phone. And she was saying, can you please just help me retrieve her dead body so I can hug her for the last time before I put her in grave?
Many families in Gaza, like this woman, have found themselves in front of a heart-wrenching task to identify loved ones through small personal items like clothes, shoes, or a piece of jewelry. The health catastrophe in Gaza has escalated to extreme levels. Operating rooms are packed. Emergency units are on the verge of collapse. Medical supplies are so scarce. One visiting doctor said she had to stop the bleeding of a man in an emergency room with an unused diaper. Some of Gaza's hospitals have become battlegrounds, with medical directors and personnel taken by Israeli forces, some of them released with torture marks or even killed in detention. Israel claims that Hamas fighters are sheltering in hospitals to avoid Israeli attacks. The World Health Organization said there were at least 1,000 attacks on healthcare facilities in Gaza since October, and that's just through July. Attacks that violate international humanitarian law, according to the UN. And that's only a glimpse of the healthcare situation in Gaza. For a population of 2.2 million people, there are only 1,400 hospital beds available. 600 of those are in field hospitals, set up after October 7. Around 10,000 patients are suffering from severe trauma, including spinal injuries and amputations that need to be evacuated from Gaza for treatment. Here's Hisham again.
We have made our position very clear in public that any military operations to be conducted inside the hospitals or near the facility of the hospitals has to be conducted according to the international humanitarian law. And there are certain measures that need to be taken and ensured by the armed forces, including first informing the healthcare staff of the military operation, ensuring that this hospital remains functional and that medical teams remain protected and are enabled to perform their duties. And this hospital is constantly fed with everything it needs or requires to keep it functional, including medical items, supplies, medication, water, food, and fuel.
These aren't just statistics or accounts from Gaza's Ministry of Health, which Israel says it does not trust because it operates under a Hamas-run government. Instead, these are international organizations like the ICRC and the WHO, which are reporting on the unprecedented civilian death toll since October 7. So why do international organizations take a different approach in terms of Gaza-related figures? Hisham explains.
We have been supporting the health authorities in Gaza for decades, and this is exactly what the ICRC does everywhere around the world whenever there is an emergency that is, naturally caused or man-made. And to separate it from that, do we trust the numbers and statistics that are issued every day or updated every day by the Ministry of Health? This is not our role as ICRC to judge the accuracy and the validity of the statistics that are issued by any authorities. However, we do acknowledge the fact that the civilian death toll in Gaza is unprecedented since October 7th.
Israel has a growing distrust of international bodies, including the UN, which it accuses of bias. Jewish-American political scientist Norman Finkelstein, whose views we heard in the first episode of this series, acknowledges this distrust, but says the consensus among these groups is overwhelming.
One of the things that's most striking in this current situation is in the past, you had to rely on human rights organizations, and even they were unreliable, to attest to what's going on during these periodic Israeli massacres in Gaza, although never on the scale like now. But now, all the information, it really does not come from human rights organizations. All the information that we have of this ongoing genocide, all of it comes from very mainstream humanitarian organizations. So who do they cite? They'll cite who? The World Health Organization. They'll cite CARE. They'll cite Save the Children. They'll cite the Red Cross. These are not controversial organizations. Unless you want to tell me that there is a conspiracy afoot among all the humanitarian organizations in the world against Israel. And that does not sound to me very plausible.
This past year has strained Israel's relationship with the UN, particularly after Secretary General Antonio Guterres pushed for a ceasefire.
This war is nothing like anyone in the world has ever seen in recent history. We've called it an UNRWA time and time again, the war of all superlatives.
We've spoken to Juliet Touma, Director of Communications at the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, which was established in 1949 to provide relief and assistance to 700,000 Palestinian refugees displaced by the 1948 Arab-Israeli conflict. UNRWA offers services such as education, healthcare, social services, and emergency aid in areas including Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. UNRWA plays a critical role in serving the civic and humanitarian needs of 5.9 million descendants of those refugees. Today, it directly employs 30,000 Palestinians. And in Gaza, it's a lifeline and a vital part of society in many ways.
UNRWA is the only United Nations agency in the world that runs a full-fledged school system. We have, across the region, 700 schools. Until the war in Gaza, we had more than 500,000 boys and girls going to those schools.
And when Israel's war in Gaza began in October of last year, their schools acted as shelters for 45% of the enclave's population. Nearly everyone in Gaza now relies on UNRWA for basic necessities, including food, water, and hygiene supplies.
The vast majority of our schools were turned to shelters, and many of those shelters were hit. Some of them were directly hit, some of them indirectly. Some were hit twice, 3 times, sometimes more. There were people who have taken refuge under the United Nations flag.
Israeli authorities then accused 12 UNRWA staff of being involved in the October 7 attacks. The UN Office of Oversight Services investigated these allegations, but before the results could come out, many countries, including the United States, suspended their funding to the organization.
When it comes to the investigation, which is done independently to UNRWA, the outcomes came out in early August. The outcomes are also available in the public domain. And according to those outcomes, there were 9 staff who might have participated in the 7 of October attacks.
Despite having no financial reserves, UNRWA was able to carry on its role in supporting the needs of the people of Gaza, as financial support came from other sources, including donors who chose not to suspend funding and some of whom even increased or expedited their contribution, Juliet told us. But the fallout of Israel's accusations has made UNRWA rethink its business model, which operates a hand-to-mouth approach on a month-by-month basis. And while Israel's airstrikes on schools turned shelters in Gaza continued, at least 220 UNRWA staff members have so far been killed since October 7, making Gaza the deadliest conflict ever in the UN's history.
And this is the highest death toll in the history of the United Nations since we started working. We've also seen the number of aid workers killed outside of UNRWA.
Since the start of Israel's war in Gaza, many international organizations have called for urgent action to ensure the protection of civilians and the provision of humanitarian aid to meet basic needs. But by forcing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians into dire conditions without adequate water, food, or shelter, Many of these groups accused Israel of breaching international humanitarian law. Here's Juliet Touma again.
I think there's been a series of violations of international humanitarian law. We are mandated in the United Nations, among the humanitarian agencies, to provide humanitarian assistance to people who need us most so that we alleviate their suffering. Have we been allowed to do this? No, we haven't been.
In May, the US State Department said that Israel may have used American-supplied weapons in ways that breach international humanitarian law, and that's mainly due to the high civilian death toll. But Israel is also accused of other legal violations, most notably its widespread displacement of Gaza's population throughout the year. This has led UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to describe Israel's actions as a form of collective punishment of Palestinians after the Hamas attacks. But how closely do Israel's eviction orders follow international rules? Here's the ICRC's Hisham Hanna again.
When it comes to civilian displacement, of course, international humanitarian law prohibits displacement of civilian communities, and there are certain conditions that have to be followed if there is a military necessity for the evacuation of civilians. First of all, there has to be ensured that they are protected all the time. Families do not get separated from their members, and people have all the access they need for the essential services, food, water, healthcare, etc., and sheltering as well. They need to be giving specific routes, timings to reach in a safe destination. And on top of all, it has to be temporary. It's timely bound. I cannot say that people have become used to evacuation orders because I know people who have been displaced over 20 times in less than a year. And each time has its own suffering, hardship, and challenges.
Article 49 of the Geneva Conventions, ratified by Israel in 1951, prohibits forcible displacement unless those affected can return home. Displaced people should also have access to all essentials while away. But most of them are unable to return home because those homes have been destroyed and are now trying to survive without any consistent access to food, water, and shelter. This isn't the first time that we've seen global calls to adhere to international humanitarian law in this decades-long conflict. The UN's International Court of Justice has looked into many related cases this year, including the occupation of the Palestinian territories. In an historic ruling in July, the court said that Israel's settlement policies in the occupied Palestinian territories violate international law and contribute to the oppression of Palestinians. Here's Norman Finkelstein.
Are you ready for this? There are war crimes under international law. Now, every Israeli soldier at a checkpoint is carrying out on a daily basis outrages to personal dignity. The way they make adults, grown men, strip, the way they confine them into cages in the sun, the way they humiliate grown men in front of their children, those are all outrages to personal dignity. That's a war crime under international law. Now, that goes on a completely daily, routine basis. People don't even think twice about it. I'm not talking yet about the raids in the middle of the night in people's homes. I'm nowhere near killing of innocents, bombing of innocents, indiscriminate shelling of innocents, all of which are war crimes.
If there's one thing that has been proven true in the past 70 years of this conflict, it's that violence perpetuates a cycle of retaliation. As we heard in episode 1, resistance groups were created in response to a series of events and the loss of land. Israel says it is only responding to acts of violence to defend itself. But many argue that this continuous exchange of violence only deepens the conflict.
On the other hand, I will not take the next step, which is to condemn the perpetrators of those crimes for the same reason as if I lived next door to a woman who had been battered mercilessly by her husband for 20 years, who shrieked and sobbed day in and day out. The neighbors knew what was happening and did nothing. The woman then called the police. Police came, but then declared this, quote, a domestic dispute, and didn't do anything. And then one day, as the batterer approaches his battered spouse for the 1,000th time, she resists by picking up a knife and lunging it into him not once, but twice, 3, and 4 times. He then grabs his pistol, shoots her, kills her, and goes to court, is taken into custody, goes to court, and he declared he killed her in self-defense. Okay? Now, under our law, he probably would win on the grounds of self-defense. But if I were to ask you to render a moral judgment, did he have the right of self-defense to kill her? What would you say? My answer is no.
Israel looks at diplomatic steps taken to end the war as a rejection of its right to defend itself. Most recently, in September, a UN General Assembly resolution calling on Israel to end its illegal occupation of Palestine within a year was passed overwhelmingly. The vote was 124 to 14, meaning 14 states opposed the resolution. What was reported in the Israeli media was that the vote was to, quote, strip Israel of the right to defend itself against Palestinian terrorism in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, end quote. In the ICJ hearings as well, Israel insisted that all of this is just a response. But many human rights experts, including the UN Human Rights Office, warn that Palestinians are in grave danger of ethnic cleansing. Here's Norman Finkelstein again.
What's going on in Gaza is a straightforward genocide. It's the systematic destruction of a people. It's the targeting for destruction of a civilian population. In the first couple of weeks, Israel's main aim was to carry out a massive ethnic cleansing to deport the entire population to the Sinai Desert. That didn't work because President Sisi of Egypt said no, and the US backed Sisi's decision. So then that option was no longer available, though it shouldn't be forgotten that that option has actually proven quite successful. Gaza is about 2 million people, roughly a little more, I guess 2.3 million. The estimates are there are right now between 300,000 and 500,000 Gazans in Egypt. We're in Egypt and en route elsewhere. There has been a massive ethnic cleansing of Gaza. It's been completely below the radar, but it has happened. The second goal of Israel was to make Gaza uninhabitable. And that meant the systematic destruction of all of its infrastructure, with the expectation that, as you know and I know, Gaza will never be rebuilt. That will never happen. First of all, at this point, the estimates are 42 million tons of rubble in Gaza. There's nothing left. About half of Gaza, half of its homes, schools, hospitals, it's gone. It's been reduced to rubble. And the estimates are it will take 10 to 15 years just to clear out the rubble.
We'll get to how Palestinians in other parts of the territories are experiencing all of this, but first we'll take a look how it's all resonating in Israel.
There was a shock. Nobody in the public at large, expected such a degree of carnage. And there was a carnage. I personally immediately raised a voice against this terrible war crime committed by Hamas. Politically, morally, ideologically, and also personally, because I lost some dear friends who were killed by Hamas, including one friend who was very, very close friend, and wrote to me WhatsApp minutes before she was murdered with her husband in one of the kibbutzim around Gaza.
This is Ofer Kasef, an Israeli member of the Knesset's Hadash-Tal bloc, who opposes his country's right-wing policies. He tells us about how Israeli society reacted to the events of October 7.
Most of the Israelis, and I do not judge, but I want to emphasize, I just analyze. Most of the Israelis seem to me that at the time they followed their emotions of shock, of rage, of pain, of fear. And because of that, they inclined very strongly to the far right. I know some people who published that, and some people who I knew in person, who were more to the left before, supported Palestinian liberation, peace, independence, etc., etc. And after the massacre of October 7, stated publicly, social networks or interviews or whatever, that they changed their minds and now they became sober.
Political instability was the theme in Israel, and the polarizing events causing protests to break out, mainly in criticism of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's handling of the situation.
You see, that was the term that was used, which of course I refer to in quotes, because for me it's exactly the opposite. So they said that they cannot trust the Palestinians anymore, and there's no way that peace can be achieved. But throughout the months, more and more people began to understand that, especially because of the hostages issue, and many because of the carnage going on in Gaza, the genocidal massacre in Gaza. More and more Israelis, Jewish Israelis, began to understand and to say that there's no way to stop the bloodshed and to save the hostages, but by ending the war and thereafter by ending the occupation. So at the moment, I can say that the Israeli society is quite polarized between those who cling to the revenge seekers and want more violence and against Hamas, against Hezbollah, against Palestinians in the West Bank, etc., and those who much closer to my views, even if not identical. People must understand that the other side of the coin of the massacre in Gaza, the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, is the process of turning in Israel into a full-fledged fascist dictatorship. And part of it is political persecution and silencing of people who raise an alternative voice like myself.
Ofer said that since then, he has been facing death threats for his anti-war stance and criticism of Israel's action in Gaza. He believes that the far-right government is escalating violence and suppressing dissent. He was also suspended from the Knesset for 45 days in January because of that.
I said that the assault on Gaza, it was in the beginning, really the beginning, or even a couple of days before the assault, the Israeli assault on Gaza began. I said that we must oppose that assault, first because it's going to kill thousands and thousands of innocent civilians in Gaza. Secondly, because it's going to sacrifice in vain 250 hostages and also soldiers. And of course, it was going to destroy Gaza, etc. And also because it will never deliver security to the Israelis.
Ofer's advocacy for Palestinian rights and condemnation of the Israeli occupation has alienated him from many circles of Israeli society.
It was very clear. I was quite isolated in that view of mine within the Jewish community in Israel when I was suspended from the Knesset because of the things I said. So that may, exemplify what was the attitude within the Knesset as well.
It didn't help him gain any favors in Israel by also backing South Africa's genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, nor did his critical views of the military.
First of all, there is a systematic brainwash in the Israeli society, a militaristic one. The state of Israel is from the very beginning, it's not a matter of the last few years or even decades, it was born to a great extent on a militaristic basis. Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, actually said and wrote a lot, but also said that the role of the Israeli army was not only to defend Israel, using his own words, but also to take part in the education of especially the newcomers, so-called Olim Chadashim, the Jewish immigrants, and to actually melt them into this melting pot that the Israeli establishment tried to pursue. So the military, the Israeli army from the very beginning was not only a mechanism of defense.
Ofer is an advocate for a two-state solution, which is the most called-for framework to end this decades-long conflict, something we'll delve into in the next episode. But right now, there's a larger issue standing in the way of achieving all of that. Many Palestinians in the West Bank have been living among Israeli settlements, but their life is far from peaceful, with these settlements often complicating any peace negotiations. Increasing violence between Israeli settlers, Palestinians, and Israeli forces is an issue that has been constantly making headlines long before October 7.
We Palestinians have been calling for help. We've tried resistance. We've tried peaceful resistance. We've tried negotiations. We've tried recognizing the state of Israel and trying to live in peace with them. But I think they remind us again that this is never going to happen.
This is Arab Barghouthi, the son of prominent Palestinian leader and political figure Marwan Barghouthi, who has been in Israeli jail for 20 years. Marwan Barghouthi is often referred to as the Palestinian Nelson Mandela. He's a strong advocate for Palestinian statehood and has significant influence in the Palestinian political landscape, despite being behind bars since 2002.
But for me, I look at him as my father. And at the end of the day, I really don't care much about what role will he play, what the polling says. Of course, I'm so proud of the love and admiration that I see from people when they talk about him and when they remember him. But at the same time, all I think about is that I want him back in our life, and I want him back to meet his 6 grandchildren that he's never met before. Usually, after 2002, I used to visit him twice a month until I turned 16 years old. After 16 years old, I would see him once every 2 years, sometimes 3 years.
Barghouthi is seen by many as a symbol of Palestinian resistance. He went to prison for charges related to his role in attacks that took place during the Second Intifada. But despite this imprisonment, Barghouthi is often viewed as a potential future leader who could unite Palestinians. In the next episode, we'll look closely at the division within the Palestinian society. But for now, Arab, Marwan's son, spoke to us about conditions in the West Bank.
What's happening in the West Bank is that the Israeli government is taking advantage of the fact that everybody is busy with their genocide in Gaza, and they're using that to make sure that we in the West Bank suffer and we pay the price. The dynamic in living in Palestine is very weird, because living in the West Bank, there are, raids and settler terrorism and all of that.
Attacks by Israeli settlers on Palestinian civilians and property in the West Bank have intensified since October 2023. At least 10,000 Palestinians have been detained, and the number of people killed by Israeli forces or during raids on the West Bank has skyrocketed. The Israeli military has said its operations mainly pursued militants linked to Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, as well as members of smaller grassroots movements. But oftentimes, civilians are caught in the crossfire, especially when Israel destroys homes and makes arrests to put pressure on the people it pursues. And despite all of this, Palestinians in the West Bank are more worried about their people in Gaza.
But we feel guilty all the time. We feel guilty that we're not getting bombarded. We feel guilty that we're not getting killed. We feel guilty that we're not with our brothers and sisters in Gaza, suffering the same suffering that they're going through. But at the same time, I always tell the people around me that staying in Palestine and living in Palestine and being a good person and being a good citizen is by itself a form of resistance.
And while civilians deal with ongoing security issues and the difficulties of just going to work or running errands under the threat of Israeli forces raiding their towns and cities at any moment, tens of thousands of Palestinians in Israeli prisons have been experiencing even worse conditions, especially after October 7, with confirmed cases of widespread mistreatment and torture, according to reports by Israeli human rights groups and the UN. Palestinians have been reported to be facing physical and psychological abuse during interrogations, particularly targeting those suspected of involvement in October 7. But they're not the only ones facing these terrible conditions. Arab spoke to us about his father's time in prison after October 7.
he's been targeted personally. And the first attempt to target him was in Offer prison a few days after October 7th, when the head of Offer prison asked him to put his hands behind his back and to kneel on the floor, because he wanted to show the other prisoners that if I can humiliate your leader, I can make a point that I can do whatever I want with all of you. When he refused, they forced him to do it, and he got his shoulder dislocated, and he didn't get any treatment for it. Then they moved him to solitary confinement in 4 different prisons. And they kept transferring him, because transporting a prisoner is the most difficult and the most humiliating experience that any prisoner can go through, because in the car they put you in a very tough position and they can do whatever they want because there is no surveillance or cameras or anything like that. They put him in different cells. They put speakers on the door of his cell with very high volume to prevent him from sleeping, running the Israeli national anthem and the creation of the State of Israel. They also put spotlights in his face in his cell, so he won't sleep. And then on March 6th, we confirmed very disturbing news that he was physically attacked. He was dragged out of his cell and they started beating him up. And he got injured in his eye, in his forehead, in his leg, in his shoulder.
We reached out to the Israeli Prison Services for a comment on this, and this was their response. All prisoners are detained according to the law. All basic rights required are fully applied by professionally trained prison guards. Since October 7, Barghouthi has petitioned twice regarding claims of mistreatment in prison. The court has examined every one of his claims and concluded that there has not been a violation of the law by IPS, end quote. So what's the bottom line? What's the purpose of Israel's war in Gaza? And what can we conclude based on what we're seeing in catastrophic loss of life, the decimation of homes, hospitals, and anything that still stands in Gaza? A UN estimate says rebuilding Gaza will take until 2040 and require billions of dollars, because right now, Gaza has become uninhabitable. Here's Norman Finkelstein again.
What's Israel going to do? Obviously, to rebuild, you need cement, right? And Israel's going to say, we can't admit the cement because they'll use it to build tunnels. Gaza is no more. They achieved that goal. Netanyahu said to thin out the population, to kill as many people as possible. The main goal, to make Gaza uninhabitable, whereas the former head of the Israeli National Security Council, Giora Eiland, put it, we're going to leave the people with Gaza with 2 choices, to stay and starve or to leave.
But to rebuild a place like Gaza, the needs are overwhelming. From clearing debris to managing human remains enmeshed in the rubble. Ongoing violence, daily deaths, humanitarian efforts that are barely making a dent. Something an already traumatized population is going through every single day in Gaza. And while the world talks about the day after and reaching a ceasefire and discussions are being had about who rules Gaza, people continue to live through a reality that nobody can even imagine. The ICRC's Hisham Hanna talks to us again about their feelings of helplessness.
Whenever we go, people just keep asking us, when can we go back to our homes? Will there ever be a ceasefire? We just want to go home. So they have made peace with the fact that they have been living in displacement with 1 year, but they are still having hopes that people would return back and find a place called home. And for thousands of families, this is not going to change for a long time, even after a ceasefire, because there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of rubble to be removed. There's a lot of streets and areas to be cleansed from the weapon contamination and garbage and rubble. And there is a need for dead body management and the handling of the human remains as a human dignity. But we still believe that bilateral dialogue with parties to the conflict, in this case with both Israel and Hamas, could be the only way of reminding them on their obligations of respecting the civilian lives, civilian infrastructure, ensure the protection of the humanitarian teams, the medical staff.
So it seems that without a political solution, the suffering will only deepen and long-term peace will remain out of reach. In the next episode, and the final one in this limited series, we'll explore the possibilities and realities of resolving this conflict through political dialogue. Please make sure to listen. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi and Dua Farid, who is also our editor. We're audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Yasmin Al-Taji is our assistant producer, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir.